My guest today needs no introduction. Ben Rhodes, who you all know, is the former Deputy National Security Advisor for Strategic Communications for Barack Obama. And now he is the author of the book, The World as It Is, a memoir of the Obama White House. Ben, welcome back to the show.
Good to be with you, Tommy, as always.
So my first impression of this book is that first, it's really good. I mean, but it's not just good because it's good writing, and it's not good because it's about Obama and I like Obama. It's good because it's brutally honest. This is not a hagiography. You are honest about his faults. You are honest about your own mistakes and faults. I feel like reading this, that you went through an evolution from defending his foreign policy to just explaining it. And it is the best explanation of the things he did and why he did them and the headwinds and things we faced at the time that I've read literally anywhere. So did it take you some time and space to get to a place where you could even write this thing? Because it certainly took me a while to realize that I was no longer a spokesman. I didn't need to respond to everything on Twitter, and I could actually step back and be a little analytical.
Yeah, it's a really good point. I think there are two things that helped me. One is like the dynamic I was going for when I sat down to write this was to try to explain to people, because there are a lot of White House memoirs or administration memoirs, and not a lot of them, are that memorable. They tend to just kind of defend positions that people took in meetings, and that's kind of it. Mm-hmm. What I realized was a little different about my story is that I was 29 years old when I moved out to Chicago to work on the campaign in 2007
mm-hmm.
and met you, Tommy. I was totally anonymous. I was a normal person, unlike, Hillary Clinton or John Kerry or Leon Panetta. So for a reader, I wanted to explain to a reader, what's it like to be like a normal guy who finds himself suddenly on a campaign and then in the White House and then in this Deputy National Security Advisor role. So pull back the curtain on the personal dynamic. What did this do to my personal life? What is it like to find yourself suddenly in that kind of pressure cooker, in that kind of limelight? And that gave me an entry point, I think, to speak more honestly about my own doubts and self-doubts and flaws. And then
you open this thing like in a long-distance relationship you hope will last, sleeping on a mattress on the floor in Chicago to married with 2 kids by the end, right? I mean, that's a massive life change.
Exactly. And this is all playing out, your life, as you know, doesn't stop when you go into these jobs. But it looks like it does to the outside world. But, I moved out to Chicago. I was, living with my girlfriend, had to do a long-distance relationship, see if that works. Is this job going to work out? I couldn't have told you then that I'd end up being the Deputy National Security Advisor. And so that gave me a kind of a voice and a way to talk about things that was more personal and less like a recounting of events. But you make a great point. I mean, the instinct that you have is to be a spokesperson for Obama and to defend him and defend his legacy. And it did take, some doing to just kind of get that mindset to the side, because I realized, overall, I obviously, would want to defend our policy, do think highly of President Obama. But you know what? That's going to be more credible if you're honest about what you did wrong or what you don't know you did right or wrong, or the warts and all on his character and my character and all of us. And honesty is ultimately more credible. And I had a weird experience when I was with you also, when we did a Pod Save the World event with Samantha in L.A. I remember some guy in the audience asked me, why did we didn't recognize the Armenian genocide? Mm-hmm. And I remember saying, well, that was a mistake. We should have done that. And it was the first time I think I'd ever done that in public, just been something we did is a total mistake. And it was liberating to be I don't have to just say, well, we were weighing these security concerns. It's a small thing, but it does allow for, I think, a better understanding for people of what it was like to go through this.
Yeah, and it turns discussions about these issues into conversations and not arguments, and that is just such a nice place to get to. I just want to go into one specific criticism and then step back more. You talk about during the Arab Spring, you felt like after those initial days of pushing the envelope on universal rights and human rights and support for the protesters, that the government and Obama as well sort of fell back into a traditional posture of supporting the military and those in power. And when you pushed Obama on this, you said, quote, at times he seemed to be using his powerful mind to find justifications for more modest ambitions. And essentially that our response during the Arab Spring didn't meet the magnitude of the change that was happening across the region. Do you think that his ambitions were moderated by cautious advisors like Bob Gates, or was it political concerns or a growing recognition of our inability maybe to influence events, or some combination of all of that?
It's a fascinating question, and I think there are two issues here. There's Egypt in particular.
Yeah.
And there, I do think that the advisors and the instincts of the U.S. government ended up pulling him back, and I think I find a lot wrong with what we did on Egypt. I supported breaking with Mubarak, not just because it was the right thing to do, but because, frankly, I didn't think Mubarak was going to be able to withstand those protests. That was a minority position in the government, certainly not the position of Bob Gates and Hillary Clinton and our agencies, national security agencies. And what happened, Tommy, after that, and you were there, you may remember this, the government never adjusted to Obama's position. Their default was, we work with the military, we work with the intelligence services. And as soon as Mubarak was out of power, there was kind of this rush to just embrace the military that was in the interim role as leading the country. And a lot of mistakes were made by the military kind of set up a dynamic in Egypt where the Egyptian military, where it was kind of them or the Muslim Brotherhood, binary. And they kind of sidelined secular parties that might have offered a third alternative. And ultimately, the Muslim Brotherhood won the election, in part, I believe, because of how the military set that dynamic up. And then ultimately, the Egyptian military had a coup, which we didn't even call a coup, which I also think was a mistake. And so I feel like I don't know that Egypt, you can never go back and say everything would have turned out differently, but I do feel like we never saw through to a logical endpoint a policy that had democracy in Egypt as its goal. That we basically, took this dramatic action in breaking Mubarak, but the government didn't change its general orientation of being deferential to the Egyptian military in the aftermath of that shift. I think separately, on the questions of military intervention in Libya and then ultimately Syria, there I think Obama on his own was very cautious, and frankly, after he did intervene in Libya, was even more reluctant to do so in Syria. There, I actually, in the book, I described kind of going through this evolution of coming to believe that he was right, and looking at these countries, realizing our ability to use our military to shape events inside of Syria or Libya was ultimately going to be very limited. So I think historians will be debating this for decades, but I do think we have to acknowledge that we kind of charged up the hill at the beginning of the Arab Spring, but we never went all in support of it, and ultimately Obama's more cautious instincts kind of came together with the dysfunction in the Middle East to lead to a much more moderated, deliberate type of approach.
Yeah, I mean, just to plug the book again for a second, I mean, it really brought me back to those 16, 17 crazy days when the protests were just roiling in Egypt. I mean, there was that final phone call where Obama told Mubarak that it was time to go. And I remember standing outside the Oval Office, I think you were in it, and hearing not just Obama shouting into the phone, but you could hear Mubarak screaming back in English and in Arabic on speakerphone. It was just, it felt like the world was moving so fast and there was absolutely nothing we could do to keep up with it. Another great little anecdote just before I move on, just talking about the president can make a decision, but the government doesn't always follow. My favorite little note in that is when you were talking about writing a Guantanamo speech, you said you sent the intelligence community an edit calling Gitmo a legal black hole. And you got back a note that changed it to detainees at Guantanamo of more legal representation have been afforded more process than any enemy combatants in the history of the world. So, a little inertia there at times.
And just real quick on that one, I mean, I was like 31 years old, right? And I'm writing this speech.
Who the fuck are we?
Yeah, and on the campaign, we've been saying, we're going to close Gitmo, and it's a black hole because nobody there has been prosecuted. And then I get in government, I write a speech like that, and you have to clear it to the intelligence community, and I get that back, and I'm like, what do I do with this?
Black is white.
Yeah, exactly. It was definitely a situation where you realize that unlike a presidential campaign, the U.S. government, it's not a deep state, but it does have its own antibodies.
Yeah. I'm jumping around a bit, but I want to go to the period that you open with in the book, that post-election period, which is, publicly Obama is the guy bucking up the whole White House. He's graciously welcoming Donald Trump to the Oval Office. He's putting on a brave face with foreign leaders. But privately, he is starting to question what happened and whether that means his entire worldview and approach was wrong, and whether he maybe backed people into a corner and led them to revert to tribalism. Maureen Dowd wrote a kind of shitty column asserting that anecdote, that chapter you wrote about, means Obama thought he was too good for us. I thought that was a misread, but you were there. What was he thinking? What was he saying? And what were those weeks and months like?
Yeah, the notion that was arrogance, that was a surprising take for me, because actually it was the opposite. He was second guessing, himself in profound ways and self-examining in profound ways. What happened essentially, and I tell this story, at first he was bucking us all up in the White House, and then as time began to pass, he started to question things like we all did, was it the Comey letter? Was it the Russians? Was it the Hillary campaign? How did this happen? But then what was really interesting is we went on this foreign trip, and the consequences abroad felt even more stark than at home in this strange way, because at home you at least have to have in the media the he said, she said, and they're both sides. Abroad it was uniform horror at what had happened. In Greece and then Germany, Angela Merkel was, I described she had a tear in her eye the last time she saw Obama. We get to the summit in Lima. Everybody's kind of asking him, well, what's going to happen now? We had this meeting with Justin Trudeau where he tries to kind of urge him to speak up for liberal values going forward. And, I think what he's referring to there is not were we wrong about the campaign or about Hillary, or he's referring to the pace of change in the United States and really the West, I'd say. The movement of people, trade, that globalization in a way had gotten out ahead of where people were, and that people, whether it's the Brexit vote or the Trump election, it showed that people were clinging to their more traditional identities, whether it's make Russia great again or make America great again. That essentially his brand of inclusive politics was not was rejected by voters who wanted to be tribal and didn't want to embrace a future that is more inclusive and diverse and tolerant and globalist, to use a word that has come under assault. And that's what he was really wrestling with, is how do we balance, as progressives, our view that the world continues to move in a certain direction with the kind of reactionary forces that want to push back against that, and that the balance, we had to take seriously the fact that this was a pretty dramatic correction with Brexit and Trump winning elections, and with Putin kind of asserting himself, that should lead all of us to at least question, well, how do we, if we're going to promote these values, these progressive values, how do we make sure that we don't do so in a way that loses, you're not going to win everybody over, but that loses contact with people who also don't want to feel like their traditional identities are under assault.
Yeah. You got called up to the Oval Office right after Obama's meeting with Trump, right?
Yeah.
So the readout in the book sounds like in person, face-to-face, Trump was a bit of he was friendly. He was open to preserving the Iran deal, talking about Obamacare. It sounded like there was not a lot of the bravado and bluster that you see in public. Was that your sense talking to Obama?
Yeah, no, there was none of it. And he was kind of bemused. He didn't really know what to make of it, because Trump had been very ingratiating and said nice things about how they both drew huge crowds, and we can draw big crowds, but Hillary can't. And Obama's trying to walk him through healthcare and immigration and the Iran deal, and Trump's not particularly engaging on that, but saying, "Oh yeah, I'll take a look at that." And so he he was kind of struggling to know what to do with that. In a way, it'd be
Yeah.
easier if Trump came in and was like, "Let's debate healthcare,"
Mm-hmm.
But that's not what happened. And I think on the one hand, sure, it made the meeting go better. It also made him think, well, like what's actually going to happen here?
Yeah, yeah. And during that same time period, meanwhile, the U.S. government, the intelligence community, they are slowly coming to terms with just the amount of Russian interference into the election and all the stunning linkages to the Trump campaign. You write about how initially you weren't read into those discussions for reasons I'll let you explain. But then when you were brought in, you guys got briefed more and more, like probably daily. What was it like slowly coming to grips and getting presented the full picture of that amount of interference when the rest of the world has no idea yet?
Yeah, it was kind of like, having the first edit of a horror movie and watching it unfold. I mean, first to your point, and I wasn't sour grapes, so I wasn't in meetings. The point I was making is essentially we saw Russia develop a certain capability to wage information warfare in Ukraine that after the toppling of the Yanukovych government in Ukraine, Putin kind of went all in, obviously in annexing Crimea, but also in creating these capabilities, these thousands of bots who could spread social media disinformation, a capacity to lie, a desire to push information into Western publics, using RT, their other platform. So we kind of got, or even intercepting phone calls. And I talk about one where they intercepted a phone call of a U.S. Diplomat and released it publicly, which had never been done while I was in government that I could remember. And what happened in the election is the Russia question was treated like a cyber issue. So over that summer of 2016, there were all these secret meetings, and it reminded me, Tommy, of like the bin Laden meetings when you and I were there, where there are these people who are really important meeting in the Situation Room, and you're not invited, and you kind of know better than to ask, like, hey, what's that unmarked meeting,
And they literally turn off the cameras that let people's assistants see who's in a meeting, if it's breaking up, et cetera.
That's exactly right. They don't put the topic of the meeting on the door and stuff, which they normally do. So I kind of figured out over time that might have something to do with Russia. And finally, in September, Susan Rice sat me down and said, hey, we've had this process going with respect to Russia, and we're going to do a statement from the intelligence community that is calling out their interference. And she kind of caught me up to speed on it. Now, the problem, I think, in retrospect, is that there were no communications people in those meetings because this was viewed as kind of a cybersecurity issue, right? So let's, who can defend the election systems and who can figure out what the hack was, and we'll bring the communications people in at the end, which is how sometimes people thought about, a lot of things. But it's not just me. Like, Jen Psaki, for instance, our communications director, she had been the target of a Russian disinformation campaign. They had spent years disparaging her, and because she would criticize them on Ukraine when she was a State Department spokesperson. We had some experience about this fake news issue and this kind of information warfare issue that wasn't really at that table. And so when the statement did come out from the intelligence community in October saying that Russia was meddling in the election, it talked about the hacking. It didn't say anything about the fake news. And so it was kind of like the missing piece of our warning and how we talked about these things. Now, I also was sympathetic to Obama. He's like, look, because I went to him and I said that to him. And he said, well, look, I mean, we can't, if I tell people that this is fake news, Trump's going to say the election's rigged. The people consuming that news aren't going to listen to me. We can debate, forever whether he should have said more. That was the basic, fact of it. Now, what did happen to me, and I describe, is right after the election, there was a meeting where he ordered the intelligence community to do this review of, what happened with Russian meddling. And right away, I start to hear John Brennan, Jim Clapper lay this out, and it's much worse than I had any idea of, even as someone who consumed intelligence and had ultimately been brought into this. And then over the course of the transition, it was like every piece of information that started to be put together pointed to the worst case scenarios, in terms of the scale of what Russia did, and then ultimately the possibility that they had colluded with the Trump people. That process of doing that review, you reach down in the U.S. government, you pull up a lot of information, you start to connect a lot of dots, and the picture got uglier and uglier until I was sitting in the Oval Office when Comey and Clapper and Brennan briefed Obama and a group of us on this review, and our jaws dropped, and it was just worse than we ever knew. Frankly, we also had no idea that the FBI had been investigating the Trump campaign. They don't brief that to us. And so I describe in the transition just getting this sense. I'm sitting in the West Wing. I know I'm gonna, I'm on the way out, right? I'm not gonna be able to deal with this. I'm not gonna be able to act on this. I'm not gonna be able to respond to this, and that the people who are the ones who might have been involved in colluding with the Russians. So it was this kind of surreal experience, and I knew kind of when I walked out the door, like, man, this stuff is gonna have a long tail. I mean, and what was even stranger is in the months after I left government, I continued to learn from the press. Each detail was worse. I mean, if you had told me in November of 2016 that like Don Jr. was having meetings with Russian agents in Trump Tower, I'd be like, oh, come on, it's not that crazy. Let's all calm down here. So the story just got worse and worse.
Yeah, we all went from feeling like we were wearing tinfoil hats to living the worst conspiracy possible. Yeah. In happier times, a couple years earlier, you ended up leading these historic negotiations with Cuba. That the process seems to be, it starts with you telling Obama that you were sick of fighting with reporters, and you wanted to do more proactive policy development in the second term. And it ends with Obama flying to Havana to push to normalize relations with Cuba to the greatest extent possible, and you later attending Fidel Castro's funeral and going to this boozy dinner at Raul Castro's house. In the middle were secret trips to Canada, meet with Raul's son, trips to the Vatican to get the Pope's buy-in. Basically the coolest diplomacy possible. Can you just walk us through the story? Like, what was it like being there and negotiating with like people? These were not sort of some flunky from their Ministry of Foreign Affairs.
Raul
Castro's son was your interlocutor.
Yeah, this is. I was excited to tell the story because I've never told it before. And I said to Obama on Air Force One after the election, his re-election, he's like, "What do you want to do second term? I'd really like you to stay in your job." And I'm like, "Look, I don't want to just defend your drone policy for another 4 years. Like, I want to do a project and something affirmative," and that led to Cuba. So we sent the Cubans this message proposing a high-level, kind of back channel from the White House to the Cubans. We didn't know who they were going to come back with, and we knew that who they came back with was going to signal whether they were serious about doing something or not. And they come back with Alejandro Castro, who's Raul's son and a hugely powerful guy in their system, and we're like, okay, these guys mean business. And I remember flying up to Canada for the first of these secret meetings, and we go off to this, literally a cabin in the woods. The Canadians were really discreet. And Alejandro Castro's son walks in. And that first meeting was just, a lot of history and the Bay of Pigs and, how many times did the CIA try to kill Fidel? And we weren't getting anywhere. But over the course of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 meetings, we built some trust. We did some confidence building. And ultimately, we had just been deciding – we'd just been negotiating a prisoner exchange to get an American Alan Gross out of prison in Cuba, and they wanted some Cubans out of prison. But I said to them, let's push this as far as we can. Let's go as big as we can. And that's what ultimately led to us being at the Vatican and making these agreements there to reestablish diplomatic relations, and they released 53 political prisoners in addition to the exchange, and to open up travel and commerce between the United States and Cuba. And it really was like the most satisfying moment I had in government because, we were doing something that just felt wholly affirmative, positive, like, righting an historical wrong, and offering a better future for Cubans in Cuba and for our relationship. Now, it also comes with a lot of good stories because, as I kept negotiating with the Cubans even after the opening, to have Obama's trip down there, and I met Raul Castro a couple of times. Had this bizarre experience at Fidel Castro's funeral where I was the only American on stage except for like Danny Glover and Harry Belafonte.
Nice.
And like all the Latin American left is there. But the last trip I took to Cuba was a few days before the end of the administration. And I had this long dinner with Raul Castro, and we're drinking rum and talking about history. And towards the end, I started kind of urging him, well, don't give up on this. Like Trump, maybe you make a deal with Trump. And he could tell I was kind of really upset that maybe Trump would put the brakes on this. And he says to me, look, and for those viewers or listeners who don't know, Raul was the Minister of Defense during the Cuban Missile Crisis under his brother Fidel. And he says to me, look, Ben, once there was a general from Ossetia, which is a former Soviet province. He's like, there was a general from Ossetia who had the authority to launch nuclear missiles from Cuba without telling me, even though I was the Cuban Minister of Defense. So I've dealt with harder things than Trump.
I literally wrote down that quote and was going to read it back to you because I love it so much. Yeah. He's like, fuck off, kid. I got this.
Yeah, I've been around the block a few times. Like, you may be sad about your election. I've dealt with the Cuban Missile Crisis.
It's so good. One other historic diplomatic breakthrough that you go through in great detail is the Iran deal. Now, President Trump recently tore it up. And reading this again, I just was thinking about how deeply personal this must have been for you, for Kerry, for everybody who worked on this, because the groundwork for this deal was laid during the campaign when Obama said he would meet with leaders he didn't agree with. And it took years of painstaking sanctions and negotiations. And then you led the team to help ensure that it didn't get rejected by Congress. And along the way, you were just personally pilloried and attacked. You were called anti-Israel. Yeah. You were criticized for participating in a New York Times Magazine profile that talked about the work you guys did to try to get the deal through Congress. You became, as you called one chapter in the book, a right-wing villain. Can you talk about what happened and what that was like for you personally, like going through that?
Yeah, well, first of all, it was, I wanted to be honest, it was just terrible, right? And, you put on a brave face when you're there. But, this is something that we worked on for years, and it was pretty technical at first, right? Like, how do we pursue sanctions, and then how do we get into negotiations? But the closer we got to a deal, the more kind of strident, unhinged, virulent the opposition got. And, one of the things I describe is that, they abided by no standards. I remember, one day, I'm seeing a Breitbart story that is taken off about me in which they have whole quotes of things that I'd said. I mean, one was so crazy. It was like Ben Rhodes said that the kiss of the nuke deal will turn the Iranian frog into a prince. And they had that in quotation marks. And then that had been picked up in right-wing media. And then they're all, Ben Rhodes is such an idiot, And I never even said anything remotely like that. It wasn't even like they took it out of, changed one word. And I had this sense of the irony for all the heat I took on the echo chamber is that there was this massive echo chamber that hated the Iran deal, but thought that the way to discredit it was to savage people like me who were spokespeople for it personally. And then I kind of walked into this trap of that New York Times story, which had that objective. And it was a really difficult because, you want to, when you're there, you kind of shrug it off and you're like, oh, we have the right enemies and, we actually won the debate, which was a hard fought win to secure it in Congress. But at the same time, it takes a toll on you when you realize that there are millions of people out there consuming this cartoon of you, for me, it was like, he's a liar. He had a fiction master's degree and he lies and he's an anti-Semite. And I talk about what that was like, and even though my mother's Jewish. And, it kind of grounded me down. And it also kind of made me probably more angry than I should have been. In other words, I got a chip on my shoulder and, I probably sunk into the muck a little bit, cared too much about what my critics were saying. And so I do have to say that having gone through that experience, which, by the way, followed me out of the administration all the way to Israeli spies for Black Cube, digging up dirt on me and my family, to have gone through all that and then have him kill the Iran deal was pretty terrible. They owned me. They owned the libs on that one. Because unlike on Cuba or even Paris, the Iran deal is kind of all, you're either doing it or you're not. A future president come back into Paris. Cuba, they haven't really rolled back. But that's kind of a binary thing. And to have spent all those years on it and taken all those hits on it to just see him tear it up, like, I have to say that's a pretty rotten feeling.
When you wrote the book and you look back at 8 years of all the things that he's accomplished and maybe some of the things that have been unwound, what do you think Obama's legacy is on foreign policy at this point? Like, what will be enduring that you and I will be talking about over a scotch in 30 years?
Well, I think there are a few things that are individual that will continue to stand out. Like, I think that, well, first of all, he whacked bin Laden, and Trump can't bring bin Laden back to life. So that's something.
True.
He really did. We had 180,000 troops in Iraq and Afghanistan when we took office, and we had like 15,000 when he left. That's a huge shift that he didn't get enough credit for. Frankly, part of his saving the global economy was getting the world to come along. And then there some of the individual pieces that look bad now will look better. Like Paris, I think is going to be a huge legacy because I think the next president will just come back into the Paris Agreement. And then the Paris Agreement will be how the world deals with climate change. I think Cuba, same thing. Like Trump has rolled some of this back, but I think inexorably we're going to open up to Cuba and he will be the guy who initiated that. So things like that will stand out. I think more broadly, though, this is kind of the note I end the book on. I thought a lot about presidents, and you actually don't remember that many policies that presidents undertake. I thought about like John F. Kennedy was probably my hero, right, as a president. And when he became my hero when I was like kind of high school, college, I probably couldn't name 5 foreign policies of John F. Kennedy. Maybe the Peace Corps. He handled the Cuban Missile Crisis pretty well. Like that's it. It's the feeling he gave. It's the speeches he gave. It's the inspiration that he offered to people. And it actually connects back to the point you made about all those foreign trips. Like, I believe, and again, people will accuse me of, Kool-Aid drinking here, but I think history bears out that, like, there are certain American presidents who make an impression on Americans and people around the world that sticks. And I think that Barack Obama meant a lot to a lot of people in the United States, but even more so, like billions of people around the world who saw him as a moral leader, who saw him as an indication of what minorities can accomplish inside of countries, and what are those people going to do? Like, what is the inspiration that he gave them? What is that going to lead to? How is a generation of people that kind of came of age and felt inspired by Obama going to end up changing the world? And so I feel like, as much as I hope that a lot of these policies look good, when you and I are having a drink in 30 years, it's going to be more like, yeah, Barack Obama is one of those kind of handful of American presidents who, changed the way people around the world thought about themselves. And frankly, I think that even if Trump won this election, the world is going to, I hope, move more in the direction that Obama was charting, a more progressive, inclusive world where nations work together to solve problems, where people of different races accept each other for who they are. And so there's an intangible to his legacy that I think will be more apparent as time goes on. And just like, we like to look back, 50 years to the Kennedys, I think people are going to look back to Obama with a similar sense that he inspired people to do things and to make change. And that ultimately is probably going to be bigger than the Paris Agreement, or certainly, even if the Iran deal had survived, it wouldn't have been nearly as important as that dynamic.